The examination of captured and downed Mitsubishi G4M medium bombers, colloquially and universally known by the Allied reporting name Betty, by United States Army Air Forces and Navy technical intelligence personnel during the brutal expanses of the Pacific War produced a profound, lingering state of engineering bewilderment that struck at the very core of differing national military philosophies. When American aeronautical engineers, ballistics experts, and veteran combat pilots meticulously peeled back the incredibly thin, flush-riveted duralumin skin of the captured Japanese bombers, they expected to find a sophisticated, highly evolved interior that matched the aircraft's undeniably terrifying performance characteristics, specifically its unprecedented operational range and its lethal payload capacity. What they discovered instead was an architectural vulnerability so glaring, so seemingly suicidal, that it fundamentally defied Western logic regarding the preservation of highly trained aircrews and valuable industrial assets. The primary source of this profound shock was the absolute, startling absence of any meaningful armor protection for the crew and, most critically, the complete omission of self-sealing fuel tanks, a basic, foundational survivability feature that the American military aviation establishment had deemed absolutely essential for multi-engine combat aircraft operating in hostile skies. To fully comprehend why American pilots and engineers were so utterly baffled by this design choice, and more importantly, to understand why the Imperial Japanese Navy deliberately authorized it, one must embark upon an exhaustive, deeply forensic historical analysis of the intersecting, often contradictory spheres of interwar naval strategy, the brutal geographic realities of the Pacific Ocean basin, the severe limitations of the Japanese aeronautical industrial base, and the profound, deeply ingrained cultural psychology that dictated the Imperial Japanese military's approach to warfare, risk, and human life. The story of the Betty bomber is not merely a tale of a flawed machine. It is the physical manifestation of an entire empire's strategic doctrine pushed to its absolute, self-destructive limits. The genesis of the G4M Betty, and the root cause of its fatal vulnerabilities, can be traced directly back to the geopolitical aftermath of the First World War and the naval arms limitation treaties of Washington and London. The Imperial Japanese Navy, recognizing that it could never quantitatively match the sheer industrial output and battleship tonnage of the United States Navy or the British Royal Navy, adopted a qualitative, asymmetric doctrine known as Kantai-Kessen, or the decisive battle doctrine. This strategic framework theorized that an advancing American fleet, crossing the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Central Pacific toward the Japanese home islands, would be systematically whittled down, harassed, and attrited by a relentless gauntlet of Japanese submarines, long-range surface torpedo squadrons, and, crucially, heavily armed, land-based naval attack bombers operating from a sprawling network of island airfields. By the time the American fleet reached the Philippine Sea or the waters off the Marianas, it would be sufficiently weakened for the main Japanese battleship line to engage and annihilate it in a single, climactic, war-winning Mahanian clash. For this doctrine to function even in theory, the Japanese required an aircraft capable of performing a task that no other air force on the planet was even contemplating: a twin-engine, land-based bomber that could carry a massive Type 91 aerial torpedo and strike moving enemy warships at a combat radius exceeding 1,500 nautical miles, a distance roughly equivalent to flying from London to Moscow, executing a highly complex, low-altitude tactical attack against heavily defended, maneuvering targets, and then returning to base. When the Imperial Japanese Navy issued the 12-Shi specification in 1937 for a new land-based attack aircraft to replace the aging Mitsubishi G3M NEL, the requirements they handed to the Mitsubishi design team, led by the brilliant but highly constrained engineer Kiro Honjo, were considered mathematically impossible by contemporary aeronautical standards. The Navy demanded an aircraft with a maximum speed approaching 250 miles per hour, an absolute operational range of 2,600 nautical miles unloaded, and the capacity to carry a 1,700-pound torpedo or an equivalent weight in high-explosive bombs. To understand the sheer absurdity of these demands, one must look at the American equivalent of the era. The standard American medium bomber, the Martin B-26 Marauder or the North American B-25 Mitchell, possessed less than half the operational range demanded by the Japanese Navy. The American bombers achieved their relatively short range because they were burdened with thousands of pounds of defensive heavy machine guns, thick steel armor plating protecting the pilot, co-pilot, and bombardier stations, and most significantly, hundreds of pounds of thick, heavy, multi-layered self-sealing rubber bladders encasing their aviation fuel tanks. The American design philosophy, born of an industrial powerhouse that possessed vast reserves of raw materials and an inexhaustible supply of high-octane aviation fuel, prioritized the survival of the aircraft and the crew above absolute maximum aerodynamic performance. If an American bomber took heavy damage, the doctrine dictated that it should be robust enough to absorb the punishment, seal its own fuel leaks, extinguish its own fires, and return its highly trained crew safely back to base to fly and fight another day. The American aeronautical engineering approach viewed defensive weight as a necessary, non-negotiable insurance policy. Kiro Honjo and the Mitsubishi engineering team did not possess this luxury. The Japanese aviation industry in the late 1930s was severely lagging behind the West in the development of high-horsepower, supercharged radial engines. The most powerful engines available to Mitsubishi were the newly developed Cassi series, specifically the 14-cylinder Cassi Model 11, which produced roughly 1,500 horsepower. While a formidable engine for its time, two Cassi engines simply did not generate enough thrust to propel an aircraft carrying the required fuel load, the heavy torpedo, and the mandated defensive armor over the vast distances demanded by the Navy's strategic planners. Honjo was trapped in an unforgiving, inescapable equation dictated by the laws of physics, fluid dynamics, and thermodynamics. To achieve the mandated range and speed, the aircraft had to be incredibly light, and it had to possess an aerodynamic profile of unparalleled sleekness to minimize parasite drag. The resulting design was a masterpiece of extreme aeronautical compromise. To reduce drag to the absolute minimum, the G4M featured a perfectly cylindrical, cigar-shaped fuselage that lacked the protruding, drag-inducing gun turrets found on American bombers. Instead, the defensive machine guns and the tail-mounted 20mm cannon were fired from flush blisters or open windows. To save weight, the airframe was constructed using a newly developed, exceptionally lightweight aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, which was remarkably strong but possessed a highly brittle nature and was prone to stress fracturing if subjected to violent, high-G maneuvers or heavy ballistic impact. But the most critical, fatal compromise, the one that would ultimately doom thousands of Japanese aviators and completely baffle their American counterparts, lay within the wings. To meet the absurd 2,600 nautical mile range requirement, Honjo had to find a way to carry an immense volume of fuel, nearly 1,300 gallons of highly volatile aviation gasoline. Because the fuselage was dedicated to the bomb bay, the crew stations, and the long torpedo, the fuel had to be stored in the wings. Traditional fuel tanks, separate metal containers strapped into the wing structure, were too heavy and wasted valuable internal volume. Furthermore, adding layers of raw, unvulcanized rubber, treated rayon, and heavy sealing compounds to create self-sealing tanks would have added hundreds of pounds of dead weight to the aircraft, utterly destroying its speed and range performance. Therefore, under immense pressure from the Imperial Japanese Navy, which adamantly refused to alter its strategic range requirements, Honjo made a decision that would define the legacy of the aircraft. He utilized the wing structure itself as the fuel tank. In this integral tank design, the actual aluminum ribs, spars, and skin of the massive, thick wings were simply sealed with a thin layer of chemical compound to prevent the aviation fuel from leaking out. The entire wing, from the root at the fuselage all the way out to the outboard engine nacelles, was essentially one massive, unpartitioned, unprotected reservoir of highly flammable liquid. When American technical intelligence units at Wright Field in Ohio, or the Technical Air Intelligence Units operating out of primitive airstrips in New Guinea and Australia, meticulously examined captured Betty bombers, they were staring at an engineering philosophy that completely contradicted their own. American engineers understood the terrifying chemistry of aviation combat. Aviation gasoline is highly volatile, it vaporizes easily, and when mixed with the ambient oxygen inside a partially empty fuel tank, it creates a highly explosive, gaseous vapor. In American aircraft, if an enemy armor-piercing incendiary bullet penetrated the wing, it would punch through the aluminum skin, pass through the outer layers of the fuel cell, and enter the gasoline. The self-sealing mechanism relied on a layer of untreated natural rubber sandwiched between inner and outer layers of synthetic, fuel-resistant rubber like neoprene. When the bullet pierced the tank, the aviation fuel would instantly interact with the raw, untreated natural rubber, causing it to chemically swell and expand rapidly, effectively plugging the bullet hole within seconds, preventing fuel starvation to the engines and, more importantly, preventing the fuel from leaking into the wing structure where a stray spark or the incendiary compound of a tracer round could ignite it. The American system was heavy, cumbersome, and reduced the total fuel capacity of the aircraft, but it saved countless lives and machines. The captured Japanese Betty bomber possessed none of this. American pilots, looking at the massive, unprotected integral wing tanks of the G4M, realized with chilling clarity that the aircraft was essentially a flying powder keg, a massive incendiary bomb waiting for a trigger. Because there were no internal bladders, no rubber sealants, and no compartmentalization, a single hit from a standard .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary machine gun round fired by a Grumman F4F Wildcat, an F6F Hellcat, or a Lockheed P-38 Lightning anywhere in the massive wing area of the Betty would yield catastrophic, irreversible results. The kinetic energy of the heavy American bullet would violently shatter the brittle extra super duralumin skin, instantly rupturing the integral tank structure. The highly pressurized aviation fuel would pour out of the massive wound, immediately vaporizing in the high-velocity slipstream created by the aircraft's speed. Simultaneously, the incendiary compound packed into the tip of the American bullet, usually a mixture of barium nitrate and magnesium alloy designed to ignite upon impact, would flash at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. The combination of the ruptured tank, the vaporized high-octane aviation fuel, the immense rush of oxygen, and the searing heat of the incendiary ignition source resulted in an instantaneous, massive, and entirely uncontainable conflagration. The flames would rapidly engulf the entire wing, burning through the structural spars with terrifying speed. Because the wing structure itself was the tank, the fire would weaken the aluminum until the catastrophic aerodynamic forces acting upon the aircraft caused the massive wing to physically fold, separate from the fuselage, and send the bomber tumbling out of control in a violent, inescapable death spiral. To the American military mind, which viewed the pilot and the crew as the most valuable, difficult-to-replace components of any weapon system, deploying a heavy bomber with such a glaring, easily exploitable weakness bordered on institutional insanity. Why would a modern, technologically capable nation deliberately send its elite, highly trained naval aviators into combat in an aircraft that could be effortlessly vaporized by a single, well-placed burst of machine gun fire? The answer to this bewilderment lay not in engineering incompetence, but in the profound cultural and doctrinal disparities that separated the United States and Imperial Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy was completely dominated by an offensive, aggressive mindset heavily influenced by a modern, militarized interpretation of the Bushido Code, the ancient way of the warrior. This doctrine elevated the attack above all else. Japanese military planners genuinely believed that the sheer aggressive spirit, the superior skill, and the overwhelming offensive firepower of their aviators would allow them to locate, strike, and destroy the enemy long before the enemy possessed the opportunity to return fire. In this deeply flawed, highly romanticized tactical paradigm, defensive armor and self-sealing fuel tanks were not merely viewed as heavy, performance-robbing encumbrances, they were actively disdained as manifestations of moral cowardice, physical symbols of a lack of offensive spirit, and an insult to the warrior ethos. The Imperial Japanese Navy prioritized reach and striking power over survivability because they fundamentally expected their pilots to win the engagement decisively, making defensive measures unnecessary. If an aircraft was lost in the pursuit of the destruction of the enemy, it was considered a glorious, acceptable sacrifice to the emperor. This offensive dogma was initially validated during the opening months of the Pacific War. During the devastating attacks on the British naval base at Singapore, the invasion of the Philippines, and the sinking of the heavily armored British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya, the G4M Betty performed magnificently. Operating from distant bases in French Indochina, the Betty bombers utilized their immense range to strike targets the British and Americans believed were completely safe from land-based air attack. Without adequate Allied fighter interception, the Betty crews executed highly coordinated, devastatingly accurate torpedo and high-altitude bombing runs, seemingly proving the Japanese doctrine correct. Range and payload had shattered the Allied naval presence in Southeast Asia. However, the American technical analysts who examined the downed bombers knew that this initial success was a temporary illusion, a highly fragile tactical anomaly that would violently shatter the moment the Betty encountered determined, highly trained fighter opposition equipped with heavy-caliber weapons and early warning radar. The harsh, bloody reality of the American technological assessment was fully realized during the brutal, protracted, 6-month-long meat grinder of the Guadalcanal campaign in the Solomon Islands. As the United States Marines seized the critical airfield at Henderson Field, the Imperial Japanese Navy was forced to launch massive daylight bombing raids from their major base at Rabaul in New Britain, a punishing round-trip flight of over 1,000 miles. This was exactly the type of long-range strike the Betty was designed to execute, but the tactical environment had shifted drastically against them. The American forces on Guadalcanal were equipped with coast watchers who provided early warning of the incoming strikes, and heavily armed Marine and Navy fighter squadrons flying the F-4F Wildcat. The Wildcats, while slower and less maneuverable than the escorting Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, were incredibly rugged, heavily armored, and armed with 6 lethal 50-caliber Browning machine guns. When the American fighter pilots intercepted the incoming formations of Betty bombers, they quickly realized that they did not need to execute prolonged, complex, and dangerous attacks against the Japanese aircraft. The American pilots quickly learned the lethal secret hidden within the Betty's massive wings. Instead of trying to kill the crew or destroy the engines, the Wildcat pilots simply aimed for the vast, unmissable expanse of the wing root. A short, concentrated, 2-second burst of 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary fire was all it took. The results were instantaneous and horrific. The Betty bombers would erupt into massive, uncontrollable balls of orange flame and thick black smoke, earning them grim, derisive nicknames from both the Allied and Japanese aviators, such as the Type 1 lighter, the Flying Cigar, and the One-Shot lighter. The attrition rate suffered by the Japanese bomber crews during the Solomon Islands campaign was absolutely staggering, representing a catastrophic hemorrhaging of highly experienced, irreplaceable aviation talent. The elite core of the Imperial Japanese Navy's bomber force, the veterans who had trained for years and executed the brilliant strikes early in the war, were systematically slaughtered in the skies over the Solomons, their unarmored, unprotected aircraft functioning as flying crematoriums. Entire squadrons of Betty bombers would be launched from Rabaul, and only a shattered, traumatized handful would return, their aircraft riddled with holes, trailing smoke, and carrying dead or dying crew members who had absolutely no armor plating to protect them from the heavy American defensive fire. The vulnerability of the Betty was so profound, and so widely known, that it directly resulted in the most significant, strategically altering individual casualty of the Pacific War, the targeted assassination of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Combined Fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. When American naval intelligence intercepted and decrypted the highly classified radio transmissions detailing Yamamoto's precise inspection itinerary in the northern Solomon Islands in April of 1943, they did not dispatch a massive strike force. They sent a specialized squadron of long-range, twin-engine Lockheed P-38G Lightning fighters, specifically chosen because their heavy nose-mounted armament of 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon was perfectly suited for destroying the highly flammable Japanese bombers. When the American fighters intercepted Yamamoto's flight of 2 G-4M Betty bombers escorted by Zero fighters over the jungles of Bougainville, the engagement lasted merely minutes. The American pilots bypassed the escorting Zeros, diving aggressively on the bombers. A single extended burst of fire from the P-38 piloted by Rex Barber into the right engine and wing of Yamamoto's Betty caused the integral fuel tanks to instantly ignite. The massive bomber shed pieces of its burning wing, plunged violently into the dense jungle canopy, and exploded, killing the most important military figure in the Japanese Empire. The death of Yamamoto was a direct, undeniable consequence of the institutional failure to provide basic survivability features to the aircraft carrying the Supreme Commander. As the war progressed and the technological disparity between the Allies and Japan widened exponentially, the Imperial Japanese Navy was finally, desperately forced to acknowledge the catastrophic failure of their offensive doctrine. They demanded that Mitsubishi modify the Betty to increase survivability. The subsequent variants, the G4M2 and the highly modified G4M3, attempted to retroactively address the fatal flaws that American engineers had noted years earlier. Mitsubishi engineers attempted to install primitive rubber layers over the integral wing tanks, added heavy armored steel plates behind the pilot and co-pilot seats, and incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks in the bomb bay to increase range. However, this desperate attempt at modernization completely destroyed the very performance characteristics that had made the Betty a viable weapon in the first place. The massive addition of heavy rubber, steel armor, and heavier defensive weapons drastically increased the empty weight of the aircraft. Because the Japanese aviation industry was unable to mass-produce significantly more powerful engines to compensate for this added weight, the late-war Betty variants were severely underpowered, sluggish, and significantly slower than their unprotected predecessors. They became incredibly easy targets for the fast, heavily armed radar-equipped American night fighters like the Northrop P-61 Black Widow and the Grumman F-6F-5N Hellcat, which could effortlessly hunt down the burdened bombers in the dark. Furthermore, the Japanese industrial base was collapsing under the weight of the relentless American submarine blockade and the devastating strategic bombing campaign conducted by the Boeing B-29 superfortresses. The raw materials required to manufacture high-quality aviation-grade self-sealing rubber, specifically natural rubber from occupied Malaya and the complex synthetic chemical precursors, were no longer reaching the Japanese home islands. The limited modifications that were implemented were often of poor quality and frequently failed under the stress of combat, doing little to mitigate the horrific death toll among the bomber crews. The final, tragic indignity of the G4M Betty occurred in the closing months of the war, when the once proud long-range attack bombers were relegated to functioning as motherships for the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a rocket-powered, human-guided anti-ship kamikaze missile. The Betty would carry the heavy Oka beneath its bomb bay, flying ponderously toward the massive American radar picket lines off the coast of Okinawa. The weight and massive aerodynamic drag of the suspended suicide rocket reduced the Betty's speed to an agonizing crawl, making them virtually stationary targets in the sky. Massive swarms of American carrier-based fighters would intercept these strike packages miles away from the fleet, effortlessly shooting down the heavily burdened, unprotected Betty bombers before they could even release their deadly payloads, turning the sky into a massive graveyard of burning duralumin and vaporized fuel. When American personnel examined the final, captured examples of the Betty after the formal surrender of Japan in August of 1945, the sense of engineering bewilderment had evolved into a profound, somber realization of the terrible human cost of a flawed military philosophy. The G4M Betty was a testament to the brilliance of Japanese aeronautical engineers who managed to achieve impossible performance metrics with inferior engines, but it was also a glaring, undeniable indictment of a military leadership that fundamentally refused to value the lives of the men who flew their machines. The American doctrine, which prioritized heavy armor, massive firepower, and self-sealing tanks, ultimately triumphed because it recognized that in a prolonged, industrial war of massive attrition, the preservation of highly trained human capital and the ability of an aircraft to absorb damage and return home was vastly more important than the temporary tactical advantage of extreme speed and unburdened range. The Betty failed not because it was poorly designed, but because it was perfectly designed to fulfill a deeply flawed, strategically suicidal philosophy of warfare, a flying contradiction that prioritized the mechanics of the attack over the survival of the attacker, a concept that remained utterly incomprehensible to the pragmatism of the American military mind until the very end of the conflict. The examination of these shattered, burned-out fuselages across the Pacific Islands served as a permanent, physical lesson in the grim economics of aerial warfare, proving unequivocally that an aircraft completely devoid of defensive protection is merely an exceptionally fast, highly efficient tomb for its crew. The legacy of the Mitsubishi G4M is inextricably tied to this fatal vulnerability, forever remembered by historians and aviation analysts as an aircraft that possessed the aerodynamic reach to strike across the largest ocean on the planet, but tragically lacked the basic engineering fortitude to survive the inevitable counterblow. This fundamental divergence in design philosophy, the American insistence on robust survivability versus the Japanese obsession with extreme, unarmored performance, was perhaps the most critical technological asymmetry of the Pacific Air War, dictating the tactical flow of battles, the terrifying attrition rates of veteran aviators, and ultimately, the complete collapse of Japanese aerial opposition in the face of the heavily armored, heavily armed, and highly resilient American aerial armada. The absence of a few hundred pounds of rubber and steel, a conscious decision made in the drafting rooms of Mitsubishi under the uncompromising demands of the Imperial Japanese Navy, translated directly into the loss of thousands of lives and the destruction of an empire's offensive capability, a brutal confirmation that in the unforgiving arena of modern combat, vulnerability is the ultimate, inescapable failure of design.